I greet you, esteemed viewers. With you is Ruslan Bailov, and this is another daily summary of military operations. Well, the so-called energy truce can be considered officially over. Last night and this morning, a massive strike was carried out across the territory of Ukraine. Dozens of ballistic and cruise missiles were used, and, according to available information, Zircon hypersonic missiles were also applied. At least 2 units. I remind you, we are talking about missiles capable of reaching speeds of approximately 8,000 kilometers per hour. In addition, the attack was accompanied by the use of several hundred unmanned aerial vehicles. The primary target of the strikes was the energy infrastructure. First and foremost, high-voltage substations of the 750 kilovolt class were hit, and not only those, as well as thermal power plants, including Thermal Power Plant No. 5 and Thermal Power Plant No. 4 in Kyiv. At the same time, just a day earlier, Volodymyr Zelensky stated that if the United States only wanted to, they would be capable of forcing Russia to stop the strikes. It is interesting to see what comments we will hear now. Military operations on the front line continue, and we, as always, are carefully analyzing the current situation. So friends, today is February 3rd, which means we are talking about events that occurred over the last 24 hours. And here it is worth noting an important point. The Russian army has taken control of the first settlement in February. Where exactly this happened? I think it is not difficult to guess. We are talking about the zone of responsibility of the Vostok, or East grouping of forces. Just yesterday, we were discussing reports from Ukrainian sources and military analysts that Russian units were entering the settlement of Tsvetkovo, and if they secured their positions there, it could soon pass under Russian control. However, events developed differently. The village of Pridorozhne, located southwest of Ternovate, came under Russian control. This is indeed serious and significant news, especially considering the number of statements previously coming from the Ukrainian side about alleged full control over Ternovate. Ukrainian sources called what was happening flag planting, despite the fact that there was footage from at least 15 points in the settlement showing Russian flags. Nevertheless, this did not prevent them from claiming that Russian servicemen had allegedly been taken prisoner and spreading other, to put it mildly, questionable statements. If you look at the map of the Ukrainian resource deep state, you can see that there are still no changes there. According to their version, only a small grey zone remains in the Ternovate area, and all the rest of the territory, including Novoe Zaporizhzhia, Radostne and Nechaivka, is allegedly held by the armed forces of Ukraine. The same applies to most of Ternovate itself, and of course Pridorozhne, despite the fact that video footage was published yesterday showing Russian soldiers and flags directly in this village. Moreover, this footage is completely unlike a classic flag planting, where a group of soldiers appears for a few seconds in front of a drone and immediately goes into cover. I have already shown these materials earlier. The Russian servicemen were in an open area, without haste or concern, for a fairly long period of time. This clearly indicates the absence of Ukrainian units in both Pridorozhne and Ternovate. Regardless of the statements from the Ukrainian side, both settlements are under the full control of Russian forces. Furthermore, the capture of Pridorozhne allowed for the strengthening of the southern flank of Ternovate, making the defense of the urban-type settlement from this direction significantly more stable. Now it remains to finalize the situation with Kristoforivka, after which the northern direction will also be generally secured. This is the first important point. There is also a second one. The capture of Pridorozhne has effectively brought Russian units to the approaches of another serious defensive hub, the village of Rozdestvenska. It is here that a recently constructed line of defense passes. I have already demonstrated it in one of the previous episodes, but for those who might have missed it or are watching us for the first time, I will remind you. The defensive structures there are indeed substantial and well prepared. Thus, a situation is developing where, after breaking through the so-called Katyushskaya line of defense, Russian forces have come almost right up to the next defensive line, at least in the sector near Rozdestvenske. Less than 2 kilometers remain to the village itself, so already during February we will, with a high degree of probability, see combat operations for Rozdestvenska and attempts to break through the new line of defense. According to available information, The Ukrainian side has deployed significant forces here. We are talking about several brigades at once. The General Staff of Ukraine has set the task of stopping the advance of the Vostok grouping precisely at this line and preventing its further movement to the west toward Orikhiv and Zaporizhzhia. How will this end? In my view, the result will be predictable. Perhaps the pace of the offensive can be slowed down, but they will not succeed in completely stopping the advance so that the grouping halts and loses the ability to move further. Furthermore, in addition to Pridorozhne, advancement has been recorded further south. At first glance, it may seem insignificant. However, if you consider the details, the picture changes. A large strongpoint of the armed forces of Ukraine was taken, and now there are effectively no serious obstacles left for clearing the adjacent territory right up to the highway. Also to the south, in the area of Huliaipol, advancement of Russian units has been noted along the highway from Dorozhnyanka in the direction of Zaliznichne. Judging by the developing situation, Russian forces are preparing to enter this settlement from two directions simultaneously. This is everything regarding the zone of responsibility of the Vostok grouping. Now let us move to the zone of responsibility of the center, or center grouping. Two sectors of advancement have been recorded here. The first is the Hryshine area. Advancement has been noted in the settlement itself. It was also possible to advance along the highway and in the forest belts on the eastern approaches, which made control over the eastern part of the village more stable. This creates conditions for further pressure. I would, of course, like the situation with Hryshine to be resolved as quickly as possible, as this sector seriously slows down the development of the offensive and requires significant resources, including primarily human lives. The second sector is the Kostyantinivka direction. South of the city, in the area of the recently occupied village of Berostok, Russian forces managed to take control of several forest belts, thereby beginning to push the line of military contact away from the settlement. The immediate task is to completely close the pocket between Berostok and Ivanopilia. On the whole, it can be noted that from the southern direction, Kostyantinivka is already quite tightly encompassed by Russian troops. And here a curious point arises. You and I are discussing the storming of Kostyantinivka, the bypassing of the city on the flanks, advancements in its outskirts, and even within the city limits, while someone continues to live in an alternative reality. What am I talking about? About the city of Toretsk. The Russian army took it back in February of last year. Then there were indeed attempts at counter-offensives by the armed forces of Ukraine. However, by May, control over the city was finally established. Nevertheless, according to the Ukrainian resource deep state, the fighting for Toretsk supposedly ended only yesterday. Just imagine, only yesterday was the last section of the city colored in on their map, where, according to their version, fighting had been continuing all this time. After this, a logical question arises. Can such maps be taken seriously? This looks like nothing other than a farce. Moving further along the map, reports are coming in from the Slovyansk direction from the settlements of Novomarkov and Minkivka. Let us start with Novomarkov. As of today, video materials have been received from there, recording the forward positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation on the western outskirts of the settlement under fire from the armed forces of Ukraine. Russian forces have expanded the zone of control inside the village to approximately 500 meters. At the same time, I remind you that this territory was previously marked as being under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, and video materials from there have been received repeatedly. Today, another confirming video was received. It is also reported that Minkivka has effectively passed under the control of Russian forces. At the time of recording, most of the settlement was already under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. All of this territory, which I am marking for you in red, is already controlled by the Russian army. The changes simply have not had time to be entered into the map. In the coming days, more substantial updates in favor of the Russian forces will likely follow here. Now let us move to the Kupyansk direction. New data is also coming in from here. Although the changes are not yet reflected on the map, they are worth talking about. Earlier, video material was published from one of the points where the forward positions of the assault units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation were located. At that time, Russian troops expanded the zone of control to 3 kilometers. Yesterday, you and I marked all of this territory. The settlement of Podoli, most of it, as well as the northern part of Kupyansk, Vuzlovyi, were colored in favor of the Russian forces. Today, at the time of the video recording, new video material was received from another point where the forward positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation were also located. This indicates a further expansion of the zone of control, both in the direction of Kupyansk itself and toward Kupyansk, Vuzlovyi. Combat operations in this sector remain extremely fierce. However, at the current moment, the advancement is minimal. Confirmed data regarding significant advancement of Russian units here has not yet been received. Summarizing the results of the past day, we can say the following. One settlement has passed under the control of the Russian army, as well as just over 9 square kilometers of territory. Ukrainian forces over the past 24 hours, as well as in general since the beginning of February, have not recorded any advancements. On this note, the review of the frontline situation can be concluded, and let us move on to what is happening in the political direction. Let us begin with a figure I have mentioned repeatedly in the past, Andriy Yermak. This is a person who, from the very beginning of the conflict, has constantly been near Volodymyr Zelensky and exerted immense influence over him. It is he whom Western media outlets have repeatedly called the Grey Cardinal of Ukrainian power. Despite his formal position as the head of the office of the president, his real power extended to almost the entire political vertical of Ukraine. He participated in resolving a wide variety of issues, from the appointment of judges and the distribution of positions in parliament to control over contracts and financial flows. It is claimed that it was with his approval that a significant portion of Western financial aid reached those it was intended for. And now, the involvement of this man and other high-ranking Ukrainian officials in Satanism was revealed by the former press secretary of Zelensky, Yulia Mendel, who is currently in the United States. In Ukraine itself, she would hardly have dared to make such statements, perfectly understanding the potential consequences. She published her message on the social network Facebook, where she directly stated the involvement of the highest officials of Ukraine in Satanism, regarding Yermak and magic. In 2019, a journalist came to a briefing at the office of the president. After the briefing, he ran not to the president, but to his advisor Andriy Yermak with a question on camera. "What were you doing at the cemetery with name?" The journalist repeated this question several times, so I heard everything clearly. It was the first time in my life I heard such a question. It remained ignored, and I never found the material. In 2020, a minister came to me with information that Yermak, then already the head of the office, was practicing magic. The minister did not go into details, but was very frightened. In 2023, a person from a serious service told me how Yermak brought magicians from Israel, Georgia, and some country in Latin America for magical rituals. In 2024, a person from the esoteric sphere told me that Yermak's wizards smoke herbs, collect water from corpses, and make dolls, which he places in a certain chest. I said that in that special chest, there are already the dead themselves. Now law enforcement agencies and even people's deputies, Yaroslav Zhelezniak, are speaking publicly about this. I never understood the system of magic and did not practice rituals. And at first, it is just as hard to believe in this as it is in the existence of ghosts. However, a long time ago, a European financier from a global organization told me about the king of an African country. I deliberately do not name it, who consulted with the spirits of trees on state matters, and once did not allow a European investor to build a factory so as not to anger the spirit of the river. This same king called the National Bank of the country and dictated what inflation should be written in the reports and what figures should be put for the gross domestic product. The comparisons are obvious. Yermak could have worked with professionals in politics and economics, read books, and developed the skills of a politician or official. Instead, he tried to block or use the energies of other people, as he imagined it. I would not be surprised if most of the statistics were also mutilated under his leadership, like that king with the gross domestic product and inflation. Here, the parallels are identical. I understand that in politics, you cannot win with brains alone. But you cannot get anywhere without them either. Today, when the country sits without heat, light, and basic needs, We can only laugh at this magical politics if we have the strength. However, I will say that in Ukrainian politics, Yermak is far from the only one who practices magical rituals. Postscript. Andrei, when you read this, think about how any decision and action of yours will now be mirrored back to you. And God is stronger. Was, is, and always will be. You should have chosen the light side from the very beginning. Such revelations have become public property and caused a wide resonance. For many people, this proved to be a real discovery, especially against the background that the West still has a poor understanding of who Volodymyr Zelensky truly is and what kind of political and personal essence he represents. Such confessions possess high value, as they clearly demonstrate exactly who was and is in his inner circle, whose advice he listened to from the very start of the war, and whose interests he defended in reality. These facts allow for a new perspective on many decisions and processes that took place in Ukrainian politics. At this point, I suggest closing this topic and moving on to the consideration of another block of issues. If an economy supported by military power clashes with an economy deprived of a comparable power instrument, the result of such a confrontation is, as a rule, quite predictable. It is precisely such a picture that we observe today within the framework of the global confrontation between China and the United States. From the point of view of aggregate indicators of strength, the parties look comparable. However, there is a fundamental difference between them. Washington possesses the political will for the direct use of military force for the sake of preserving and restoring global dominance, whereas Beijing's readiness for such actions remains uncertain. This explains the events around Venezuela, including the pressure on Nicolás Maduro and the blackmail of the government of Delcy Rodriguez, as well as the escalation of the situation around Iran, near whose shores an impressive naval grouping of the United States Navy is already concentrated. Such steps by the administration of Donald Trump can be viewed as a direct and demonstrative challenge to China. However, Beijing at this moment prefers not to accept this challenge, choosing a tactic of evasion and waiting for a more convenient moment for a response. At the same time, one cannot exclude a scenario in which such a favorable moment may not arrive at all. The United States has already effectively cut off China's access to Venezuelan oil, and in the future, they are capable of doing the same with Iranian supplies. Moreover, in the event of Iran's fall, the Chinese initiatives launched back in 2013, the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, known collectively as the One Belt, One Road project, will be under threat. In such a scenario, these large-scale strategies can be considered buried. Further developments may lead to the isolation of the People's Republic of China, in which China's partners will be systematically eliminated by the United States, either by military or by political economic means, and forced to abandon cooperation with Beijing. Alone, it will indeed be extremely difficult for China to withstand the American military machine. The situation looks completely different in the context of the Russian-Chinese strategic link. It is precisely such an alliance that is capable of throwing a full-fledged military challenge to the United States. Acting together, Moscow and Beijing could theoretically already build an insurmountable barrier on the path of American power expansion. However, based on the current situation, neither China nor Russia is yet ready to move toward the forceful containment of Washington. Both countries are trying to resolve their contradictions with the United States through dialogue, avoiding direct confrontation. At the same time, it is obvious that until Donald Trump runs into a real military barrier on the path to restoring a unipolar world, his administration will continue to move forward in an aggressive and assertive manner, literally pushing its agenda through. The question is only when, and if at all, a unified political will, directed toward a tough rebuff without any negotiation, alternatives will awaken in Beijing and Moscow. This is why modern world politics has found itself at a unique point. The former hegemon is no longer what it used to be, but it is desperately trying to prove that it still possesses its former power. Its rivals are not inferior to it in terms of strength, but for now they prefer not to demonstrate the real balance of capabilities, counting on the fact that he will eventually drive himself into a dead end.